So if you had a daughter and she was 10 and she got raped and she was
Well,
going to give birth
I
and
do
she
have
would,
a
no,
daughter.
wait. Oh, and she was going to give birth and she was going to live. Would you want her to go through that and carry her baby?
That's awfully graphic.
It's no, but it's a real life scenario that happens to
down.
many people.
The answer is yes, the baby would be delivered.
Oh, okay, great. So that's insane.
Well, as you can imagine, this topic of abortion generally, and then of cases of therapeutic abortion, like an abortion in the case of a rape of a legal minor or of a child, that this is just about as controversial and incendiary a topic in bioethics as one can imagine. And for people who come down on different sides, there is an anger often and even a seething contempt for the opposing view, which I think you can get a sense of within this dialogue between Charlie Kirk and this young lady. And what I want to consider in this short video is how one can begin to offer critical nuance to a discussion on an incendiary topic like this that could maybe bring sides a little bit closer together, maybe not coming to agreement, but at least coming to respect that another person could have a reasonably different view on the issue. And the biggest factor that is at play here is to cultivate nuanced categories about the topic. Once you begin to cultivate nuanced categories and you begin to think it's not so black and white, then that opens up the possibility that other people could reasonably disagree with you. And once you recognize that other people can reasonably disagree with you on an issue, that opens up the door for critical dialogue and perhaps some degree of future agreement between opposing parties. So that's what I want to explore here. And I'm going to just take a few minutes and first of all talk about developing some critical nuance for the pro-life stance, and then conclude with critical nuance for the pro-choice stance on this issue. If we are going to develop nuance for the pro-life position, it's going to come as we recognize that there is an extraordinary degree of change that happens to a fetus from fertilization to parturition or birth. And this creates what is for many people a sliding scale of moral evaluation of the significance of that life and the obligation to protect that life developing in utero. So we begin right at the point of the fertilized ovum, becoming a zygote, initiating a course, a trajectory of fetal life, of human development. This is the human being at the earliest stages. It's a human organism, it's a human being. Whether you call it a human person is going to depend upon your philosophical view of what personhood is constituted by. Does personhood, for example, require the ability to engage in volitional action, have self-consciousness or minimal consciousness, the ability to have creativity or language acquisition? These are all different dimensions of various theories of personhood. And depending on whether you believe one of those is correct or you believe simply being a member of the species human is sufficient to qualify you as a human, in which case even a zygote here could be a human person, that is going to depend. But people have different views as to what a person is, or a human person, and thus they'll have different views as to whether a zygote is a human person. And even recognizing that complexity is important. So then you move from the early stages of the zygote and you move to the stage of a blastocyst. Now, this is right at the point of implantation into the uterine wall. Many contraceptives slash abortifacients prevent implantation. So they harden the endometrial wall and prevent the blastocyst from implanting. Now, whether you call that an abortion, an early abortion, or whether you call that a contraceptive act may depend. People have different definitions here. It seems to me that any death of the blastocyst, so post-fertilization, if you end up killing a zygote or a blastocyst through some contraceptive means, to my mind and my definition, it is functioning as an abortifacient. But then the question becomes this. So let's say that the 10-year-old that this young woman references in her thought experiment with Charlie Kirk, she is impregnated by a rapist, and can she take some sort of contraceptive abortifacient which would prevent the implantation of the blastocyst at this stage into the uterine wall? That's a very specific question, and it's a good question. Now, that is a more specific question than just, can you kill a baby? And hopefully you can appreciate that already at that point, one can begin to think on the pro-life stance, great, I value the importance of allowing a blastocyst to continue on a trajectory of life, but this is a different kind of question than some of the later stages. At 4 weeks, the blastocyst has now become a full embryo. At 5 weeks, it is further developing, and somewhere between 5 and 6 weeks, the embryo begins to have a heartbeat. Then at about 8 weeks, this really begins to look like a baby. It even looks like that this is a child that's looking at you, and you go on to 10 weeks. Now, that is a very familiar view. Many people, this is now what they begin to think of. I don't believe that at 10 weeks, the fetus is yet sentient or it can feel pain. And so that becomes another significant factor. Not only having a fetal heartbeat, but then the ability to experience pain, which may not occur until the beginning of the second trimester. So looking at this and then continuing on from 10 weeks on to a full term pregnancy, hopefully we can appreciate from a pro-life stance how people could have reasonably different views as to whether it could be morally warranted to end the life of this developing human being or human organism. And that ending the life of the organism at these earliest stages is not the same necessarily from a moral perspective as terminating at a later stage. The final thing we want to turn to now is to talk about it from the perspective of the pro-choice person who's thinking about that 10-year-old girl. And here I'm just using an AI auto-generated image of what a child might look like. But I think that it's important to have an image here to recognize that you're not just talking about an abstraction. You're talking about requiring this child who did not ask to be sexually assaulted, who was experienced one of the worst traumas one can imagine, to now extend that trauma through 9 months and giving birth to the child that was produced by this rapist, through which they were impregnated, and to experience the psychological continued trauma and the physical trauma of a body that very likely is not yet prepared to carry a child to term and to give birth to that child, which could result, for example, in the requirement of a cesarean section. I mean, the amount of trauma. One thing that we should never lose sight of is people get very offended. I'm going to conclude with this. People get very offended from the pro-life stance about referring to fetus as a parasite. I agree, 100%. But one thing to appreciate, as offensive as that analogy is, that a human fetus developing in utero does extract a significant amount of nutrition, of energy from the female woman or child that is carrying that fetus to term. And that has a very great impact. Now, when you're talking then about that physical impact, let alone the challenge not just of parturition or birth, but of gestation, and imposing that on a 10-year-old that was the product of a sexual assault, I just want people to appreciate what you are really suggesting. That's why this young woman bringing this question to Charlie Kirk says we need to think in concrete terms about an actual 10-year-old experiencing this, like in a couple years ago in Ohio, when there was a 10-year-old who was impregnated by, I believe it was a 27-year-old man, and she could not get an abortion in the state because of the state laws at the time against abortion. If we do the work to think about these issues from both ends, from the pro-life stance, from the pro-choice stance, hopefully this could shed a little bit more light rather than heat. And we could, even if we don't agree with the other, we could at least have more sympathy and understand where the other person is coming from and why they take the stance that they do. So that's my quick 2 cents on what we might begin to do to change minds on one of the most controversial bioethical topics today?